We recognize that the term disaster has sort of a disastrous tendency of being used in a lot of different ways. And so we like to say that community organizing is disaster preparedness, and that disaster relief is community organizing. So when we're talking about the acute disasters, these like crisis moments, these flash in the pan sort of moments, a hurricane, an earthquake, these are the sort of situations in which we see the ongoing social disasters becoming amplified. And so we have a really wide analysis of what we say disasters are, but what the function of this network is to respond to these crisis moments, these acute disasters, when the levees break, when the fires are raging, and the social chaos that's always going on, these chronic disasters that are always going on become amplified. Then we're hoping to build up each other's movements. We're not an organization that's hoping to administer aid upon different communities, much like the Red Cross and FEMA try and always fail to do. But what we're hoping to do is, as individuals, as autonomous groups, and as regions, uplift each other in our efforts that are always going on already. And then when these moments happen, we can all come in, stand shoulder to shoulder with each other, and amplify those movements to make sure that everyone's needs are being met to the best of our abilities as a collective. And that's nationwide right now. We're not hoping to do that outside of the country because we don't think that parachuting into other places is a very wise thing to do, and it's not very respectful to people if that's not an ask. And so what we're hoping to do really is just listen very carefully to the needs and concerns of community members. I just really want to emphasize that what we're going to be doing today is breaking down a lot of, like Sarah just said, the history of what we're here to do and why we're doing it, and hopefully learn a little bit more about what the network means and how we can develop this thing together collectively. We're not the whole network, the four of us up here. There's a lot of us out here, and we're all doing a lot of amazing work in our homes. I did not reference this slide at all. I'm sure you all are wondering why this picture of these spiders, squirrels, and mushrooms are up here. I like to say that if we look at these, yeah, these are morels. I like to say that if we look at these spiders up here, can the people in the back see these images? I know they're kind of small. We like to spin webs. We're trying to find more ways of connecting with people in an intersectional way. These squirrels remind us that many hands make for light work, that it's not a vanguard, it's not individuals who are going to, help liberate and form relations in our communities, but we have to do that work together. And these morels I really enjoy because it makes me think of the underground mycological, or these like fungal roots that connect all of us, our hearts and our minds and our communities. And I think that that's something, all of these images we need to hold really dear. We're going to be using a lot of images tonight from the Beehive Collective. We really enjoy that they use art. Tyler is a bee. He's done a lot of work and touring with them, talking about all of these different posters that you see in the room displayed tonight. They use a lot of animal images and plant images to demonstrate the non-human approaches to resistance against colonization, resource extraction, and emphasize their involvement in all of this as well, because we know it's not just us out here, but the whole world is a part of this struggle against all of these different forms and disasters that are around us. We also like their really cute nature and aspects too, and they help us not tokenize other human beings by trying to depict them in various ways. And so we're going to be using this art as sort of a portal tonight to display all of the stories that we want to share with you.
So I'm going to start with a little personal story, actually. I said I'm from Menominee Land, southeastern Wisconsin. What I didn't say is that I'm from the most conservative county in all of Wisconsin, which is like semi-rural, middle class, upper middle class, white. You know the names of your neighbors, and you know everyone on your street, and you wave hello and goodbye as you drive by each other, and you give each other Christmas cards, but there aren't really many connections of like actually meeting each other's needs and like deep involvement or very much involvement in each other's lives at all. And Wisconsin sometimes gets snowstorms, and I specifically remember this snowstorm in my late teens, and I was driving my brother's friend's home, and we came across this car that was stuck on a completely iced over sharp curve that was on the edge of a cliff. And of course we couldn't get by, but we also couldn't leave them there for obvious reasons. And so this started a 4 to 5 hour collaboration between us and the people in the car and the people down the street of like, okay, who has salt? Do we have enough salt? Who can push the cars where? Can we talk to these people so we can leave this car in their driveway? Can we talk to these people so we can leave this car in their driveway? Oh, we tried to get this car out of the valley, but that didn't work. And it sounds like quite a mundane story, but the reason that I remember it is because of how it felt. It felt so amazing to just be in the moment and working with other people to do something very obvious that needed to be done, to help in a way that we were asked to, in a situation where it was needed that we happened to come across. And one of the main points that we want to get across to y'all today is that the reason this felt so good is because it came out of mutual aid, which is really inherent to human beings. It's something that we do naturally, and so when we act in that way, it feels really good. An important caveat, addendum to this story is that because of these systems of oppression that are around us all the time, they're this toxic air that we breathe, water that we swim in, it would be impossible for us to not internalize at least some of that. And the way that that shows up is that we discriminate in our mutual aid, and it doesn't flow freely between all human beings. So we really need to continue doing the important work of seeing how we've internalized these systems of oppression and pulling them out of us so that our mutual aid can flow freely between all humans again. And it's actually not just between humans that mutual aid flows, it's between all beings. This behavior of helping each other is actually the natural tendency of all life. And because of that, this mutual aid came first. It came before colonization, it came before capitalism, and these systems have deliberately tried to bury this tendency and sever all of these webs of meeting needs, because if we have these webs, we don't need them. And so what we have today is this monster of disaster capitalism, with the many arms being the many different tactics of the ways of severing these webs. And it can be pretty well summarized by as power systems who profit off of disasters. Ones that just happen, also ones that they didn't know that they would create, and now even ones that they're intentionally creating because they've realized just how profitable they are. So, like I said, we're going to get into the tactics of disaster capitalism now, so that we all are really on the same page about what we're dealing with. But before we go through that, just a quick reminder that mutual aid really is right there underneath the surface, so that when these disasters fracture these entrenched status quo systems that cause us so much pain, because our natural response is mutual aid, these disasters can also be an opportunity to create the more beautiful and just world that we want, that we need, and that we know that we deserve.
So one of the first tactics of disaster capitalism that we want to share tonight that we think is really important is that of predatory lending. I'm sure a lot of people have some sort of an understanding of what this is, with these ridiculous mortgages that people have to pay because of taking out loans from banks that are trying to, put people into situations where they have this ridiculous interest that they'll never be able to pay back, leading to foreclosure and displacement. Or maybe student loans, once again, procuring all of this interest, these institutions knowing that students will never be able to pay these things back. So when we think of predatory lending, we think of these situations where people are being subjected to instances where a power above is giving something with this ridiculous, something behind their back, right? And so I really enjoy this image here of this sort of Jabba the Hutt kind of toad that's making a deal with the water development. This is an image from California depicting a lot of the privatization of water happening in the Central Valley. I want to take us back to my home state, or the configuration of land and people that unfortunately is called a state in Michigan. In Flint, a lot of people are familiar with the Flint water crisis, but a lot of people aren't so familiar with how it was started. That's a human-created disaster. It was something that was intentionally produced because of negligence and because of these different lending schemes that happened There's a tactic with predatory lending of giving small cities and municipalities or even whole countries these really ridiculous loans that they'll never be able to pay back, to subject them to these chains of having to pay back all of this interest forever. And this happened to Flint, this happened to Detroit, this happened to a lot of cities across the country, unfortunately, and it's happening all across the world. In Flint, what happened was after all of these loans from the state were unable to be paid off and this huge deficit was created, the city bankrupted and an emergency manager was placed. An emergency manager isn't someone who's voted in by the people, but it's a corporate person who's placed in by the governor. And so this emergency manager, because they were working with the waterways and the municipal water systems in Michigan, decided that they wanted to revert or divert the water from its original source into a source that was coming from the already polluted Flint River. And so that polluted water was going into the already corroded lead pipes of the neighborhoods within Flint, which then created a super disaster, leading to the spread of disease and these plagues within the city of Flint, and has continued to inflict damage and will continue to inflict damage on people's lives. This has been going on for about 4 years now, and Flint is not the only place that has poisoned water. What happened after that? What happened after the poisoned water is the more important point to this story, that after these predatory lending schemes come, there's always something in place. We like to say there's like a domino effect of these different things, these cascading disasters that come out of them. So after this poisoned water was coming into people's homes, let's say they didn't want to pay for this poison, and if they discontinued paying for this poison, their water was shut off. If their water shut off, they get open for eviction. If they get evicted and if they had kids, Child Protective Services can come and take the kids. They get left then open to incarceration and to further displacement and destitution. People are being kicked out because of this man-made disaster. And this is happening, and this is intentional, and these processes and legislations are in place to continue these things. There's no safety nets for people, at least not the people who are in these situations where there's room for development. I like to say that being from Michigan, me and Betsy DeVos go way back. I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I was born in the DeVos Family Children's Hospital in Butterworth. And so the power that a family has, the DeVos family, within the state of Michigan is really terrifying, and it needs to be called out. A lot of people don't know where Betsy came from before she became the Secretary of Education in this country, and that's a very powerful position. A lot of people joke that Betsy never actually stepped foot in a public school before stepping into this position. I think that's very important for us to recognize that this power unchecked, these systems of power and the accumulation of them lead to these situations where individuals, families, corporations are able to set up traps for human beings to pave the way for more development through displacement. And understanding these things before a disaster hits us gives us a lot more, I think, defensive ability, our ability to see the whole thing before it hits us so we know what to expect. And that's why we want to share these really important stories.
Predatory lending is often followed by privatization. It's basically a 1-2 punch that brings more resources and power into the hands of those who already have most of it. Privatization, if you're not familiar with that word, it means generally when private owners, individuals, wealthy families, or usually corporations, are taking control of what was formerly public goods, public lands, public services, things like schools and water and electricity, other sort of state-run industries and things like that. This image here shows a surgeon that's gutting out these public services like water and electricity and things like that. Originally, this image was meant to depict the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. That's that's a big international financial institution that comes in when countries default on their loans. The IMF comes in and says, well, now, in order to keep participating in the world system, you have to do what we call structural adjustments or austerity. If you've heard those terms before, basically what that means is taking public services away from the public, selling them off to corporations, and jacking up taxes at the same time. The United States is doing this. The United States government is doing this in Puerto Rico right now. Prior to Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico had a state-run power company called PREPA. PREPA was It was old, it was in disrepair, it was overly centralized, it was 100% coal power. There were a lot of issues with it, but at least people's electricity was affordable. Now, after the storm, Prepa has been sold off to private corporations. The aid that the U.S. government has given to Puerto Rico is actually just more loans. Surprise, surprise. And a lot of people are afraid that they're no longer going to be able to afford things like electricity. Next, please. Similarly, we see the school system in Puerto Rico being privatized. Here we see a bulldozer is pushing this public school off the cliff, and the community is losing all these valuable services. It's towing behind it a private prison to allude to the really disastrous changes that are happening in our priorities in this country. The prison also has some details like this sewing machine as a reference to prison labor and the slave-like conditions that are happening. We're going to talk about that more later. But just wanted to point it out in this picture. So in Puerto Rico, the public schools are being privatized. They're being taken away and sold to these for-profit institutions in the form of charter schools. They're being taken away from the publicly elected school board and sold off to these private corporations. Charter schools often underserve students and create a prison-like environment as they cut corners and focus solely on profit. And this move actually follows a model that was established in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Prior to Katrina, New Orleans had the worst performing schools in the country, but that wasn't because the teachers couldn't teach or the students couldn't learn. It was because of segregation and underfunding. But Hurricane Katrina was used as an excuse to eradicate a lot of government service programs. And just to give you a sense of it, there was one state legislator who said after Katrina, he said, "We've been trying to clean up New Orleans for years, but now God has done it for us." They were celebrating the fact that all these poor people of color, had been forced out and had lost their homes. And immediately after the storm, 4,000 plus teachers and other school staff were fired, effectively breaking the strongest union in the state. And they were replaced by untrained Teach for America volunteers, or the teachers who were rehired got less wages, less benefits, and they lost their pensions in the process. Overnight, the New Orleans School Board went from administering 200 plus schools to only 5. And by now, those have been whittled down to just 1 or 2. So all the other schools, if they weren't closed permanently and effectively just destroyed, they are still funded by taxpayer money and yet run by people who have no oversight of any kind. They're not accountable to anyone. So Betsy DeVos wants to use exactly this same model in Puerto Rico right now. And in fact, that's her plan for the whole country, right? It's happening in Puerto Rico very quickly because of the opportunity that they see in the disaster and calamity. But things like the school voucher programs and things of that nature are seeking to do this in all over our country.
So, in these moments of chaos that are caused by acute disasters, there's a lot of upheaval, and this allows for the social fabric to be broken, at least temporarily, and that's what allows the government and capitalists and other actors to basically swoop in and privatize or to engage in predatory lending and basically take advantage of the neighborhood and the areas there and institute programs that they wouldn't normally be able to do if the community was still organized in the way it was before the disaster. So the one positive thing is that when these moments are of breakage occur, where the social system is fractured even momentarily, that also creates a window in which mutual aid can bubble up and grow as people start coordinating with each other and meeting their own needs. But the state also recognizes that this is a threat to their systems of domination, and therefore they need to be present there in order to channel people back into the exploitative systems that they've been in. So here we have this the World Trade Organization, because the law is what's really doing the oppressing here, it's just the police and the military who are carrying it out at the expense of the people in the areas trying to just support each other and survive. And they're trying to crush all these people here who are resisting, the Zapatistas, the farmers, the construction workers, the animals, all these groups that are slowly but surely chipping away at these oppressive structures. They recognize that that's a damage and they're trying to hit them and knock them down. But we keep just popping up in this moments because, again, mutual aid is our default. And when we need each other, that's what we're going to do time and time again. We're going to take care of each other. And so the the government realizes, and the capitalists who are also tied with it realize that this is a threat to them. So they have to make sure that they're there to institute law and order. So oftentimes what we see in the wake of acute disasters are really heavy police and military presence. And they're there just to control the situation and try to crush mutual aid wherever they can. One example of this comes from the relief efforts in Puerto Rico. A group of people with mutual aid disaster relief went down there to do support work, and there was someone who wanted to disrupt these mutual aid programs, and they called in a kidnapping case, and this resulted in a no-knock SWAT raid on a church compound that was being used for a mutual aid distribution and coordination among volunteers. And they literally went in there like no-knock raid style with no warning and had people, like in some cases literally at gunpoint, people who were just trying to help each other. And although they went in there for the kidnapping, which to be clear, there was no kidnapping in case you were worried, they went in there about the kidnapping, but they used it as an opportunity to try and disrupt the mutual aid networks as much as they could. When they went in there, they didn't ask about kidnapping. They asked, have you ever organized against fascism? Have you ever thought about overthrowing the government? Have you ever raised your fist? These are the actual questions that they asked in the wake of this. And there are many instances in which the government and the military, and even sometimes the aid organizations that are supposed to be helping, have gotten in the way of mutual aid. One other example comes from the Hurricane Irma response in Florida, when people were just going out on their own private boats and rescuing people because the state wasn't, and these people were potentially not going to make it if their neighbors didn't help them out. And instead of like celebrating this and being like, great, we're so happy someone can pick up the slack and these people can be saved, instead FEMA was there blocking the highway on-ramps and off-ramps and trying as best they could to prevent people from saving each other. And overall, this feeds into this need to restore what is considered law and order. But we should recognize that like law and order are not like innocent, or they're not neutral. And up here we have this image right here, which is the fasces, which is where it's associated with fascism, if you notice the similarity in words. And this came about during the Roman Empire, which is one of the like most dominating colonial powers to ever like be on the face of the earth. And it was associated with the bureaucracy that like allowed that dominating power to exist and to spread to other areas. And the highest magistrator was called a dictator. And so when we think of law and order, and when we think of like bureaucracy and dictators, these are not neutral words like we've been taught to believe they are. They're not words that keep us safe. They're actually the oppressive structures that keep us in these exploitative like positions that allows the state to capitalize on us. And so we've seen an increase in police militarization over the years, and it's especially been increasing in the past few decades, as has resistance to globalization and climate change producing pollutants in the environment. And it's gotten to the point now where even like Springfield, Massachusetts, which is like this like really, really small like city, you know, with like 2 skyscrapers, their police department has a grenade launcher, which I cannot think of any reason why the police need a grenade launcher. And a lot of times in these situations, instead of seeing like aid networks coming first, it's often the military and the police who are there on the scene first, because the control is always the number one thing, not the people or the safety of the communities. One of our friends who is part of the network who did relief efforts in Florence had a report back with us, and they said like for days people were like, where's the Red Cross? Where is FEMA? And they didn't know where these aid networks that were supposed to be our saviors essentially were. But who they saw almost immediately was Border Patrol. we're using these moments of upheaval where people don't have their usual support networks and don't have their ways of sheltering themselves in order to like swoop in there and arrest people and then put them in private prisons where they can make more money off of them, and also clearing them away from different areas. And this is not like limited to just the military and the capitalists alone. There's also private militias that go out in the wake of disasters and often respond as well. A lot of like, unfortunately, white supremacist groups do this and organize together to do this, and oftentimes in disasters you'll see signs that say like, you loot, we shoot, or something like that, where private citizens are taking it upon themselves to be judge, jury, and executioner and get to decide, oh, this person's like stealing things, therefore they're an awful person and a criminal, even though they may just be taking food to feed their family. And so these groups are also additionally problematic. And oftentimes these military groups, beyond just sort of controlling the situation and pushing people back into certain roles, they often put conditions on aid as well. Oftentimes there's like a stockpile of goods, and this like military is around them, guarding them and making sure that people only get like maybe one box or like one bottle of water, which often isn't enough to sustain their needs. And also we believe that people know their own needs best, and the communities are the ones best situated to make decisions about what they need. But instead the military is like putting a firm handle on it and only giving aid to people who they deem necessary. So people who are undocumented, people who have warrants, like can't go get aid in these situations. And instead, they privilege the people who are, oh, you can't see it. You can kind of see it here. There's like this scale, right? And they have all of these dead bodies of people who are marginalized in our society. And all of that is going just to support this top hat on a velvet cushion here. And so these efforts to control often make aid only available to people who are more privileged and more so than people who are marginalized. And these are people who already get aid and are benefited by society in general. And of course, they absolutely do need help in the wake of disasters, but it's not in any way comparable to the amount of aid and support that people who are marginalized get. And these military officials and personnel are assuring that those people can't get that aid, which then puts them in a situation of basically like one that is meant to drive them to extinction and not allowed for them to survive. And this allows for them to take marginalized people and remove them from those lands, which then offers them up those lands and those resources to other people who can then capitalize on them.
So as Olivia was just alluding to, crises create, disasters create displacement, and a main tactic of disaster capitalism is to take advantage of this displacement by elongating it or displacing even more people, and usually selectively displacing people. And something that happens when people are displaced is that they cannot participate in public process around what recovery from disaster should look like if it is taking place in the same place that the disaster was. And we've seen this in Puerto Rico in the wake of Hurricane Maria. So right now, there have been ongoing like town hall-esque public process meetings around what the recovery should look like. But what happened was that the government paid for 200,000 Puerto Ricans to leave, to go to the mainland US, and didn't pay for them to go back. So how are you supposed to be part of your recovery process if you're not physically there? So what we're seeing these days are activists trying to literally Skype in Puerto Ricans who are in the mainland US, like into their public process meetings so that they could have a say in what their recovery is going to look like. And Olivia in particular was just talking about land grabs and gentrification, which we see in general and particularly in the wake of the disaster. So again, in Puerto Rico, after Maria, the space that was opened up by people being displaced was taken advantage of by developers. And in particular, in Puerto Rico, we're seeing plans around the creation of a city that's just run on cryptocurrency, so that even if Puerto Ricans were able to go back, it would not be the place that they had left, and that's not just because of the physical destruction that the hurricane wrought. We also, unfortunately, see that it's not just governments and private corporations that take advantage of disasters. We've also seen that nonprofits and NGOs act in their own interests in the wake of disasters. And the example that we like to tell is one of Charity Hospital, which is was a big amazing hospital in the center of New Orleans in a poor, Black, mainly not privately insured demographic. And it was super important. It was the only place with a psych ward, and it was actually minimally damaged by Hurricane Katrina. So with a little bit of cleanup work, it was declared like good enough to be opened if it was going to be cleaned up a little bit more a few weeks after the hurricane, but it wasn't. And today it stands as a shadow of its former self with very limited services. And the reason that it wasn't reopened, even though it was obviously really needed in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, is because it's run by Louisiana State University, and they had long had plans to build a brand spanking new state-of-the-art hospital complex in a different part of the city with a whiter, more affluent, more privately insured client population. And part of their funding plan for building this new complex was to get compensation from FEMA. And the only way that they could do this was by proving that at least 50% of the value of the hospital had been damaged, but of course it wasn't. So Louisiana State University took them to court, and the estimate of how much damage was caused was adjusted upwards over the years until it hit the threshold where they received the compensation so they could build their new hospital complex. So we really have to remember that these nonprofits and NGOs are also not going to act in our interests, and that's why we think it's really important to have decentralized grassroots responses to disasters, and that's why networks and groups like Mutual Aid Disaster Relief exist. And we feel the need to point out here that we are registered as a nonprofit, but the only reason we do this is to keep our finances in order, and we are a completely decentralized network and never vying for FEMA compensation. We're just here because we really believe that decentralized grassroots approaches are the way to go.
And just like we did in the land acknowledgement in the very beginning, we need to remind ourselves that this is always coming back from, like Olivia had just mentioned a moment ago, these hundreds, if not thousands of years of empire and colonization that have been affecting and inflicting damage upon people for a very long time. I really like this image here, or at least I like to dissect this image here, of the triangle trade. A lot of us are familiar with it, just like a lot of us are familiar with the word colonization, or it's becoming more popular nowadays to be anti-colonial. But what does that mean? What are these words? How do they affect us? How are we internalizing them? To be anti-colonial means to be against colonization, right? To be decolonial means to be actively participating in a process of composting that system inside of ourselves, outside of ourselves, within our communities, and together as collectives. Challenging ourselves to think, challenging these systems to see their way out, and to replace that with these seeds of community, right? And so when we talk about colonization, what is that thing? We like to say that it has 5 different parts. The first part is invasion. There's the coming in, right? Finding a land, finding a people, and then taking is the second part. Not just the resources, not just the human bodies, the hearts, the minds, culture, turning these things into private commodity, right? Turning them into capital. The third part is to make, to use these new resources that have been stolen, to use these human bodies and labors and cultures to then start to create new cargo, new resources, new goods that can then be exported, which is the fourth part, sent back to, in the case of the triangle trade, Europe or other places. We can think of America as being a colonizing force, which is, continually creating colonies. Puerto Rico is not seen as a United State, it's seen as a territory. Please.
Can you just explain what you mean by the triangle trade in particular?
Yeah, I will. Thank you for asking that clarifying question. The fifth is to return, and that's the wrap back up, right? So the return would make that cycle close, and that's the triangle or the circle, which is the trade route of this particular time period. So in the triangle trade, we saw the East India Trading Company and these other Dutch, French, English, Portuguese, different companies and independent traders following this route from Africa and other parts of the world that had been colonized, taking their bodies, taking those cultures, and shipping them across to the Americas, to the so-called New World, to then extract and to take sugarcane and other raw goods, to make new cargo, and then to ship that back to Europe, where they could then be traded for guns and for gold.
Rum to Boston.
That's correct. To then go back to Africa and continue the cycle continually. And we see this, we amplify this, because we see it happening today. It's still happening. These tactics are still occurring. Invasion, taking, making, exporting, return, the expansion.
Can I add one more piece to it
Please
because it's
do.
so mind-numbing?
Absolutely.
Because also while they were taking land from people who were squatting or just like living in general on land, they started fencing off the land in England and putting sheep on that land, and then they would take the wool from that sheep and make people in the colonies wear it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the questions and the input. Right.
Question?
Yeah, please.
I'm very curious, what is the Kool-Aid Man exactly? What's the symbolism there?
No, I appreciate this. I appreciate this. So we really like this image here. You all are asking questions that I was hoping to intuitively continue to speak about. You're ahead of the curve. This ship here in the bottom right-hand corner, it has these motifs to the modern prison industrial complex. We understand that these people who were taken from Asia, from Africa, were not slaves. These people were prisoners. They were taken in this act of war and aggression to then be used in this fuel for the machine to continue to expand. And so it has these motifs to like the watchtowers of the old or of the modern prison, recognizing that slave labor today still exists. And so this King Kool-Aid on this ship over here is a motif to the like sugar and rum that were taken from the Caribbean. The flags on the top of the ship are rotten teeth, and the crow's nests are cupcakes, and the masts are these sugar canes. And then we see up here motifs to Chase Bank being on this giant gold ship that's being used in the export of these different resources to trade for gold and for guns. And so we see this happening. We saw it in the invasion of Iraq, the invasion, the taking, the privatization, implementing all of these different private developers and private security forces to then continue this expansion to go and continue to spread what is so-called freedom, right, across the world. And so we recognize this, and I also want to capstone this conversation by saying that we've just talked about a lot of really heavy stuff, right? And so if we could, maybe just take another deep breath in. Because that's some heavy fucking shit. And I don't like talking about this stuff. I don't like talking about colonization. I don't like talking about fascism and racism. A lot of people think that when we're talking about these things, that we're some sort of like a disaster cult, right? Like we're continually obsessing over these really terrifying things. But I think from being able to recognize and have an analysis of these things, we're able to become more well-equipped to build what it is that we want. Out of the blackness comes everything that we want. We're able to create, we're able to imagine, and that's our power against these systems. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about right now.
So, we think it's important to recognize that disasters rarely happen in isolation. In fact, like disasters often beget more disasters, and there's a lot of like trickle-down disasters of both the ecological and the social sort. And so those were a lot of the tactics of disaster capitalism that we often see in the wake of disasters. And oftentimes people's minds are just so focused on like, what do we need to like have shelter and have food, that they're not prepared or not aware of these disasters that can swoop in and how they and the different tactics that can be used against you, which is why we like bring these to you now was like a warning from other places that we've seen these happen to. But now we're going to change gears a little bit. We're going to go through a timeline. This is to talk about how Mutually Disaster Relief as a network has grown, as well as some of the lessons we've learned along the way, and also some of the repression that we've faced in the wake of these disasters as well. Unfortunately, a lot of it is centered on the East Coast, and therefore on hurricanes and floods. That's not because we only care about those disasters, that's just where the networks has sort of organically grown out of. And that's also why we're on this tour, is to reach other people so that way we can all support each other and share information and resources, no matter where the disaster is or what kind it is. So I think before we start this timeline, it's important to note that climate and driven and geophysical disasters like earthquakes and such have been increasing dramatically even since 1950. There's been a huge spike in disasters. And we like to use this image for this because you can see as the earth is getting worse and worse, the profits are going up and up, and there's a small group here that are well protected from the disasters in the background that they're causing, that are profiting off of these, and they have this cake to represent 500 years of colonization, and we recognize these actions as an extension of colonization and capitalism, which we view as the first major disasters to ever hit this continent.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the Common Ground Collective, which formed in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Two of the groups that were most inspiring to Common Ground were the Black Panthers and the Zapatistas. The Black Panthers were a militant group that was a part of the many movements for freedom and human dignity that were happening throughout the world in the 60s and 70s. The Zapatistas are still around today. They started in southern Mexico in the mid-90s, and they're an indigenous group fighting for autonomy and control of their land, and they just want to live their life the way they want to live it. And they've been really inspiring and poetic and visionary as well, influenced a lot of the global justice movement that was big in the late 90s and early 2000s. So here in this image we see a panther. It's not a black panther, but close enough, right? We see some snails who are wearing these ski masks because they're definitely Zapatistas. The Zapatistas choose the snail as their sort of mascot because they're small and humble and close to the earth, and they feel like we can learn a lot from them. Common Ground was first started by a former Black Panther named, it was started when a former Black Panther named Malik Rahim reached out to everyone he knew, friends and comrades all over the country, and asked them to come protect him and his community from these white supremacist vigilantes who are roaming around shooting black men at random. And Common Ground eventually grew into this enormous organization because so much attention was being focused on New Orleans at that time. Hurricane Katrina was something of a watershed moment in this country for everyone to realize that actually the cavalry isn't coming when we need them. The state's not actually there for us when we really need them. And Common Ground started with a free clinic in Algiers. Malik's neighborhood was a neighborhood that hadn't been flooded, fortunately. And it did a lot of food and water distribution, beginning out of Malik's driveway, but then spreading to many sites all around the city. There was roof tarping, and one of the biggest programs was gutting out the moldy drywall and rotten refrigerators and all this sort of stuff so that people could get back in their houses and start to fix them up again. They were really toxic, and it eventually, because Malik understood that, like in this image, all of our different communities are connected. All of these different issues are connected. Hurricane Katrina was, as we call it, an acute disaster, but Malik was well aware that there were these invisible disasters ongoing before the hurricane, these daily disasters of racism and poverty and segregation. So these bees here are looking at this map. They're planning out how they can meet the many diverse needs that people have. So Common Ground started a legal clinic where people could get legal aid, and a tenants' rights association. There were internet centers, and there were gardens and bioremediation, which means using plants and fungi to clean up toxins. There was a women's shelter. There was a children's free breakfast program and numerous varied educational programs. Over the course of about a year, Common Ground attracted tens of thousands of volunteers from all over the country and all over the world. And all of this was inspired by the Black Panther legacy, and especially their what they called survival programs. So back in the 70s, J. Edgar Hoover said that the Black Panthers were the most dangerous organization in America. people assume that what he meant by that, you know, they see these like photos of panthers on these neighborhood controls carrying guns and stuff, and they just think that's the reason why they were so dangerous. But that's not it. It was because of those survival programs. What J. Edgar Hoover was afraid of was how much self-respect and dignity and empowerment and political education and courage people were building up by doing all of these mutual aid programs. I'm sure you all have heard of the famous Black Panthers, the Children's Free Breakfast Program that the Black Panthers
There
did.
was one in Carbondale.
What's that?
There was one in Carbondale.
Oh, really? That's awesome. Yeah. So, like, the very first thing the Panthers ever did was these neighborhood patrols, kicking the cops out, carrying guns and stuff. But the very second thing they did was the Children's Breakfast Program, right? So that gives you a sense of what their priorities were. They also did a number of free clinics, free groceries, drug rehab programs, all sorts of. They also had this very holistic approach, and we were super inspired by that. Unfortunately, the exponential growth of Common Ground and the chaos that came out of that created this situation where systems of oppression really took hold within the organization. And all of this was at least partially responsible for the implosion that happened only a little over a year after it began. Switching spots.
So, next on our timeline is Superstorm Sandy, which hit the New York City area in 2012, and this was shortly after the height of Occupy Wall Street in 2011. And because of that, because of Occupy Wall Street, there was already this like latent structure there, and there was a listserv, like a communication thread, that had died down a bit since the height of Occupy Wall Street. But in the days before Sandy hit the area, it was revitalized. And so the response, which called itself Occupy Sandy, was actually really fast. And they learned a decent amount of lessons from Common Ground, both what Common Ground did well and things that could have been done better and differently. And they had lots of diverse programs, food, legal, medical, construction, and they were actually reasonably effective because they had started from this like, ya basta, enough already. We know how this goes. We know we're gonna have to do it ourselves, so we're gonna do it and we're gonna do it well. And actually, the Department of Homeland Security took note of how effective their response was and wrote a report called the Resilient Social Network, basically saying that their like person-to-person small group response model was more effective than the top-down centralized approach of aid. And unfortunately, similarly to Common Ground, not only did they learn a lot of those lessons, but they also made some of the same mistakes at a slightly smaller scale. So in particular, we saw some members of Occupy Wall Street being the ones to make the decisions instead of including everyone who was affected more effectively in that decision-making process.
So, in 2016, there was really severe flooding that occurred in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and the relief efforts there came together under the name Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, which was the first time that the name was used. And a lot of people who were doing support work here had experiences with Occupy Sandy and Common Ground and were taking those lessons with them into this relief effort. But what was really interesting about this relief effort that's different from in some ways the previous efforts was that the majority of the volunteers were from the community. And it's hard to see in this image in particular because of the size, but all the shirts they're wearing are like community organizations in Baton Rouge and Louisiana that they're associated with. And so it was really survivor-centered and community-led, and there were some outside volunteers who came to help, but it was when there was a particular ask. Unlike in other instances like Common Ground where you had tons of people from the outside like swarming the area and oftentimes overriding the desires of the people who were living in the community. And they were very successful with each other, and this is like one of the lessons that we took from this is that like recovery should always be survivor-centered and community-led rather than us like swooping in and be like, we're the aid experts, you've got to do this, this, this. Like, that's just another form of colonization and domination, and we don't want to perpetuate that. And they were really successful, actually, and gutted collectively over 100 homes and helped to repair them. And at the end of all this, they had some extra equipment, particularly respirators, which they then sent up to folks at Standing Rock as an act of solidarity, recognizing that even though they're in different locales and different regions, their struggles are the same. And just as that pipeline will inevitably, already has, but also will continue to pollute the areas there, that all feeds back into the struggles that we're all facing collectively as we go through these issues of upheaval and crisis together.
Not to mention that that tail end of that pipeline is being built in Louisiana right now. And folks are like struggling against it. There's a no bayou bridge poster in the back wall.
Thank
Thanks
you
for bringing that
mentioning
into the
that.
story, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for. It's almost like all our struggles are connected or
Yeah.
something. Wow. Surprise. I don't know if you do this. So that was in 2016, and then 2017 hit, and I say hit because, boy, what a year it was. And it was in a lot of different ways, But yeah, J20, hey. Sorry, I'm a former defendant, so I'm very excited to have that all off my plate. Yay. So 2017 was one hell of a year, to put it lightly, and we had all these record-breaking storms and disasters hitting the area. Much of the East Coast was like literally underwater, while like almost the entire West Coast was on fire, which seems pretty damn apocalyptic to me. And all these storms were hitting back to back to back, and one would like set a record, and the next one would break that record, and then that one would get broken by the next one. And so all these quick sessions of storms, things started to escalate very rapidly, and the upward curve we've already seen in disasters increasing spiked dramatically during 2017 and has continued since then. So the first storm that hit was Hurricane Harvey, which hit the Gulf area, in particular Houston was affected. And so the relief efforts that popped up there started when some people like heard someone needed rescue, and they were literally like, we've got an inflatable kayak, let's like load up and let's get to it, right? And they went out and did a rescue and got that person to safety, and then they saw that there were more rescues that were needed, and so they just kept paddling in their kayak and rescuing people. And then like volunteers started showing up at their house being like, how can we help? And all of a sudden supplies were getting dropped off at their house, and people were meeting there, and through all these small steps that they were just taking one at a time, they ended up accumulating this like community force, which they called West Street Recovery, which is literally named for the street that they are on. And they started doing really wonderful relief efforts and uniting the community, where they would like teach each other skills and then help them pass them on, and making sure that everyone had at least some space for themselves that they could live in, and then would go to help the next people and go to help the next people. And in this instance, people from Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, some people in the network got in touch with West Street Recovery to basically ask, like, what do you need? And we helped like support them by sharing their fundraising pages, as well as their like Amazon wish list for what supplies they need, so that way people could directly aid them rather than us having to like channel it through us and then get it to them at some point, which wastes a lot of time. And as we've seen with big NGOs, oftentimes a lot of that money goes missing, like the Red Cross, when they took billions of dollars to help recover Haiti, and they built like 8 homes or something, literally like 8 homes with $1 billion. So we prefer to just like boost the supports of the community efforts that are on the ground. And so that's what we did in this case and many others following that. And one of the particular things that we did that was, that we, meaning people in the network, not like us four in particular, they reached out and said like, hey, here are the different phases that you're gonna have to go through in order to recover, because these people were learning on the fly and doing it very well, but also didn't have a whole lot of experience in this. And so these are some of the images that that were sent to them: the gutting phase, the mold and toxin remediation phase, and the rebuilding phase, which helped them get an idea of the timelines that they were going to be working with and what was going to be needed each step along the way. And they were so effective, actually, that the Red Cross ended up coming to their house, for which the organization is named, and we're like, how are you getting aid to people so efficiently? And so not only do we have the government, in the case of Occupy Sandy, recognizing that these networks are better at and more efficient at distributing aid, but also now NGOs, where like this is their deal, supposedly anyways, are also recognizing that these aid efforts, these like decentralized, community-driven efforts, are way more efficient than this top-down structure. And in the wake of Hurricane Harvey, community relief was especially important because there's such a large undocumented population there that are especially at risk in these times. And when people were trying to flee the hurricane, the oncoming storm, there were border patrol people checking papers on the highways, basically saying like, sending a pretty clear message that like, if you don't have documentation, like you don't deserve to live, and we want you to stay here and suffer and hopefully be wiped out so we don't have to deal with you. And it's important to remember that like, it's very easy to get caught up with yourself and just trying to keep your friends and family alive. And of course you are struggling, but also remembering that other people are struggling, and it's often the people who are incarcerated or who have warrants or who have who are not documented, who struggle the most in these times, and we have to be mindful to remember them in the wake of all of this. So, just literally a few weeks later, another massive hurricane hits, this one called Hurricane Irma, which hit Florida. And so some of the mutual aid disaster relief crew that's based in Tampa were like getting all geared up for the storm because Tampa was expected to be hit like a lot worse than the other areas. But then a last minute change in the storm actually meant that the southern bits of the state were hit a lot worse than Tampa was. And so Tampa sustained some damage as well, and the groups organized there to help do relief work, but they also directed a lot of aid down to the people in the south who needed it. So literally like big trucks of supplies would come through, and they'd be like, just keep going south and take it to the people there. And some people did some relief effort there and got in touch with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who are, we picture them here with these ants, because they're basically like a farmer collective that started doing like work to help protect their communities, and have gradually like spread to supporting other marginalized communities in the wake of the everyday social like chronic disasters of capitalism and the exploitation that occurs. And they've been doing this for decades and are still going strong and adapting to the needs of the community. So the Tampa crew reached out to these folks and basically said like, what do you need and how can we help, and made sure to like lift their fundraising pages as well as their supply list, like once again, and boosting the efforts there and supporting them however they asked for, rather than us like going down there ourselves and being like, okay, we're here people, don't worry about it, we got you, like, you know. And one other story I want to point out from this in particular, just to speak of like again to this point of how marginalized people are often forgotten in the wake of these storms and how they are devalued and like left for dead essentially, was as the hurricane was approaching, the Polk County Sheriff in Florida made a Twitter post, a tweet, what some might say, that basically said, if you are seeking shelter in if you're seeking shelter and you have warrants, you can find shelter in the Polk County Jail. And that is almost verbatim exactly what was said, which is pretty clearly a signal that like people who are considered criminals, who dare to break the oppressive law and order that we have to live in, are devalued and they're not wanted. And oftentimes in the wake of disasters, prisoners are literally left in their cells. We've heard stories of prisoners being like neck deep in water, just trapped in their little cell and not even able to save themselves, just being locked in there to die in the wake of these disasters. And that's always something we should bear in mind, that we're insecure, sure, in these moments, but there are other people who need our advocacy as well. So, just a few weeks later, another massive hurricane hits, Hurricane Maria. It hit many different areas in the Gulf region and devastated them, but we want to focus on Puerto Rico in particular. So in Puerto Rico, the nation the island was devastated. Some communities lost as much as like 80 to 90% of their structures, and the death count is still like very low, but the like actual death count is somewhere around like 4,000 at this point, who have died in relation either directly as a cause of the hurricane or like indirectly because of the conditions afterwards and the prolonged implications of colonization in that area. But some really beautiful things have happened in response. there are these CAMs set up that are stands for like Centers of Mutual Aid, or Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, and they basically have been organizing around like meeting the needs of the community and creating these community hubs. So one of the main ones is in Mariana, and they overtook an abandoned school that wasn't being used and started turning it into a community hub where everyone can come, and they'll basically pool their resources in order to make sure that everyone in the community can access them. And it's really amazing because when we first came on this tour, there were like somewhere between like 7 and 9 or so. And we talked to someone a couple of weeks ago, and they said there's almost like, there might be as many as 11 now, which is really amazing to watch these things multiply in the wake of disasters and to fill the cracks of like the state aid that we're supposed to rely on and to keep popping up. And many of them are signaling that they want to continue this and to continue to like create their own spaces together that resist the colonial form in the wake of these disasters. So Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, again, like reached out to folks there and found ways to support them. Through the network, they were able to get some solar panels, which we have a little worker bee setting up right here, as well as some water filtration centers that they've been sharing among the different CAMs. And some people from Mutual Aid Disaster Relief also went to the island to do relief efforts, but it was largely people who had a connection to the land already. They had family there that they wanted to check with, like spoke the language, or they had particular skills, like medic skills, that were being asked for at that moment. And really developed these relationships with the CAMs that we're still maintaining to this day as they do this really wonderful recovery work. And when the Mutual Aid Disaster Relief folks went there, they found that there were a lot of areas that FEMA said they just like couldn't get to, and some folks from the network, literally in like a rented sedan, were able to just like drive into these areas. So either FEMA didn't try, or they're lying. But either way, we know who we can depend on and who we can't, right? And right now, a lot of the efforts there, the state is getting really nervous about and is trying to quash. So there was some really brutal repression on May Day this year that teachers are facing there because, as Tyler said earlier, like they're trying to privatize the schools in Puerto Rico and inflict this like secondary trauma upon the people there. But thankfully, the people in Katrina were like, oh, we know what happens next. And they reached out to people in Puerto Rico and said like, hey, watch out, they're gonna come for your schools, they're gonna come for your cultural institutions and for the things that keep you all connected and together. And so thankfully the people there are organizing against this and are able to like support each other in these moments. And some of the CAMs, especially the one in Mariana, have indicated that they want to continue to build this collective power together and to build like a new Puerto Rico, one that's like for the people, actually the Puerto Ricans, not some like crypto billionaires who are trying to claim the island. And the state is really scared about this and is trying to pressure them to stop.
And a disaster that's happened just recently this year is Hurricane Florence. Hurricane Florence hit the coast of North Carolina. One of the cities that was more widely hit and devastated by this was Wilmington, North Carolina. When we think of hurricanes, we don't generally think of the Carolinas or New York City. So we see, as Olivia was saying earlier, the not only frequency of these mega disasters, but their irregularity too. Like they're happening in places that we wouldn't expect. And so in Wilmington, North Carolina, the city, because its bridges and the roadways going in were wiped out because of the hurricane, it effectively became an island. There was no way in or out. And so just because of their own initiative, a bunch of people decided to take, there was a course of within 3 days, about 60 different flights of single-engine planes, people who had the skills, people who had the connections, people who had the ability and the resources and the skills to fly these planes in and not identify just as mutual aid disaster relief, because that's not our goal. Our goal is not to try to convert all of you here to become mutual aid disaster relief. We don't own that thing. That's a tactic. It's something that we all do. You know, we don't need a banner to fly under in order to do the thing. And so these people were able to do it. They didn't do it because of a political ideology. They didn't all identify as anarchists. They weren't all a part of a single organization. They just came in and did what they knew needed to be done and delivered 50,000 pounds of goods, food, water, medicine, into the city when the Red Cross and FEMA did not. Like Olivia said earlier, the first people that were seen from the state was FEMA. Was ICE. It wasn't FEMA. It was ICE. I need to back up. And so that says a lot of where their priorities are. And I really enjoy this image here because we have these little worker bees who are building homes for other types of creatures of the air. And I think that's a really cute idea, to think of ourselves as doing this work, not just for ourselves, not just for the people that we know, but for the people around us that might think, act, and believe differently than us. And this is still going on in Wilmington. This hurricane hit a little over 2 months ago, and those relief efforts are still happening. One of the groups that rose up is Blue Ridge Autonomous Defense. They're a medic collective, and they're well connected within the region, and so they were able to, on the ground, connect with people who are also doing social justice work in their area, and make sure that all of those lines of connection for resources from Chapel Hill and Richmond, these places that weren't nearly as heavily affected, could then also help deliver these chains of aid. And when there was so much coming in, and people were going down to help out with Hurricane Michael or other affected areas from Hurricane Florence, like Lumberton. Lumberton's doing a lot of really amazing work right now too. I suggest you look them up on Instagram. Lumberton, MADR. You'll be able to see that there's this like interconnectedness. While people are traveling down to deliver aid in other places, they're picking up supplies, learning more, listening to the people who are the most affected, and delivering aid to where it needs to go in the moment. Because we're doing this thing together, it's sort of trickling into itself. We're sort of like these like overlapping DNA strands. All of us are kind of like in this chain link fence, all of us together holding ourselves and each other up by our collective efforts and strengths. And so, moving next, I want to mention what's going on right now, live time in Chico, California. We see that most of California right now, of the large areas that are being affected by these fires that are happening, which are just completely outside of people's realm of expectation, right? These are unprecedented disasters that are happening. They're becoming worse because of poor management systems, poor relationships to the natural environment. And so these super fires are starting to happen because of poor management and poor practice. A lot of California is under a state of emergency right now. And so, Paradise. Has anyone heard of the campfire that's going on right now?
Yeah.
So the campfire just completely wiped out a lot of Paradise, this small town that's mostly inhabited by elderly and low-income people. And so these people were displaced, and a lot of them ended up into a parking lot at a Walmart in Chico, California. Chico is a place that we actually got to go to on our leg of the tour this time around here in the fall. We just came through there and we were able to connect with people. We did the 2 nights, we were able to do the presentation like we're doing now, and a workshop the next day. And a lot of the skills, resources, and the brainstorms that we were doing, and the tools that we were able to share, and the lessons that we were able to learn from them, they continued to amplify, and they embodied those things when this disaster hit, and they knew they had to step in and do something. They now call themselves, the people that were at that event and the people that they've connected to in their wider community, North Valley Mutual Aid, and they're doing the damn thing. They're using the workbook that we created through our last tour in the spring. That's the summary of the workshop that we'll be doing tomorrow, and they're hosting workshops, they're hosting town halls in their community to try to brainstorm, and they've created 6 different working groups to try to tackle this big issue of not just the fire and the smoke, but also the houselessness, the ongoing epidemic that's now being amplified by this fire. It was a tinderbox, right, that just exploded, this issue that was already happening of poverty, of displacement. And they're trying to make sure that in their organizing, they're not leaving people behind, because the people who are doing the decision making are the people who are the most affected, and that's their motivation, that's their goal. So what the larger Mad Relief Network has been able to do is ask and listen directly to the community based on what they want. We were able to deliver about 1,400 masks just last week that they requested, and then supply the different principles that we'll be sharing with you all tomorrow, and the different tools and resources that we have to share as a collective effort, as a larger network, and continue to brainstorm and create these different like Amazon wish lists and fundraisers, so that the community itself determines what it is that it needs and can meet those needs based on its own terms and conditions. And that's a really beautiful thing to happen and to see live time, despite the fact that there's something really devastating happening to the backdrop of all of this really beautiful organizing and community togetherness. We want to say, lastly, that we have this set of principles that we're really excited to share. I want to be candid for a moment and just say that depression is inside of me. and I imagine that's something that probably resonates with a lot of people in this room. I know that there's that phrase that sickness is not a sign of personal responsibility. It's sick society, right? Like we've been inflicted damage by the society that we live in. So to be depressed is something that I think is a point of solidarity among us. When we're talking about mutual aid, it's in our name. What does that mean? We're going to be learning from you all tomorrow what you define as mutual aid. We're going to be hearing your stories and your definitions of what that is and how you see it practiced. So I don't want to harp on this right now, but what I want to say is that it's these systems of togetherness. When we're in these depths, when we're in the flames, when we're in the receding waters of these floods, this is when we can come together and actualize ourselves as human beings with dignity and recognize that thing in each other. Or just getting warmed up.
We can do this. Yeah. Another really core value of ours, and it's our motto, kind of, is solidarity, not charity. And this is really the idea that survivors are the first responders. They have agency, and they're not like just the recipients with nothing to offer that charities paint them to be. And so our role, when we are not the most affected, is really just supporting survivors to support each other, which means leveraging our privilege, which can either come from like our particular intersecting identities or just from the fact that we're not the most affected, so that we can act in ways that end up redistributing power. And we know that we can only do this through being in relationship with the most affected. Self-determination is an inherent right of all beings, and it's also an inherent ability of all beings. The sign says, we recognize disaster survivors' rights to determine what their needs are and how others can best assist them. Take what you need. Shockingly, people are all experts of their own needs. So when we act in this way, not only is it easier, but it creates this beautiful culture of trust that makes so many other things possible.
And we like to say that autonomous direct action gets the goods. We say that autonomous direct action is self-determination realized. When we're able to see each other and take these steps together, I want to reflect what I just said. Not all of us can step. We need to think intersectionally, right? When we're able to do what we see as being necessary in a moment, when we're able to find in our hearts what we know is in consent with the people around us, we're able to get the goods. And so we say that autonomous direct action has a lot of different ways that it can be formed. Community gardens, peer-to-peer counseling. These things are direct action. It's not just going out in the streets. It's not just being out there and doing the physical labor, right? And so I want to emphasize that as well.
And when we are not the most affected, and we want to engage in autonomous direct action, it's not just about asking permission from the most affected, and it's not just about building consent with the most affected. There are also other principles we can follow to make sure that we're really elevating the leadership of survivors. And so one of these is mandar obedeciendo, which is a Zapatista principle that really centers the importance of listening. And subsidiarity is a Catholic principle that says that the most powerful, their role is actually just to support.
There's a really amazing small story within a larger beehive poster that has this bunny rabbit who's like coming down with a parachute, and they have their big ears and they're listening to the community before they enter into it. And we think that's really important. Horizontality and participation. These are two things that we really emphasize. When we say horizontality, we mean not doing the top-down thing, which is a really easy thing to fall into. We're going to talk tomorrow a lot about disaster patriarchy and the savior complex and these lessons that we've learned through these different iterations of disaster relief. It's easy to fall into these forms because we've been hit with them over our heads for so long growing up, these systems of white supremacy and domination through patriarchal rule and things like this. But as we're composting this and building shoulder-to-shoulder strength with our friends and our neighbors, that amplifies our ability to participate and uplift the participation of the people who have been subjected to the bottom of these top-down forms.
And sustainability, actually, this is a picture of some of the solar panels in Puerto Rico, and these are some of the people from the Centros de Apoyo Mutuo. So sustainability comes really from this awareness that it's not just humans that are affected by disasters, and it's not just humans that are contributing to the response to these disasters, and it's not just humans who can stand to benefit from our responses to these disasters. So in our responses, we really have to be collaborating with all life. Sustainability also is about like extending things in time. So really taking this opportunity of disaster response as community organizing seriously and rebuilding better so that we're not perpetuating the systems that harm us.
And thinking sustainably, we like to talk about dual power. I have this image here of compost. I've been using that term a lot because I like to think that instead of like trying to break down the system and destroy the capitalist structure that's all around us, we have to think really organically about how is it that we're actually going to achieve this. As this one system crumbles and starts to decompose, we also have to, at the same time, have to do that second step of building the world that we want to create together. Otherwise, this power vacuum is left, where the fascists and the racists then continue to do what it is that they want. And we see these opportunities within disaster for collaboration rather than capitalization, and that's what we want to amplify. Intersectionality is another thing that we have to think about, thinking once again sustainably. We understand that in this activist culture here in the United States, there's this idea of like burning out. And so we have to understand that rather than thinking of ourselves or each other as being disposable, we have to think intersectionally about our energies and about our identities. We have to recognize that, like the Carbondale River Collective was able to in the 1960s and 1970s, they were able to break down. This was a group of like predominantly black lesbian women. I don't know what I'm doing. Black and lesbian women. I had like a weird computer glitch there. They understood that their liberation would not be found in the predominantly white supremacist feminist movement of the time, or in the predominantly patriarchal black liberation struggle of the same time. So they understood that these intersecting identities, this lattice inside themselves, this web of all of these different identities, was essential for recognizing, because the people who have the most oppressed identities at the bottom are the ones who should be leading. Because like Fannie Lou Hamer said, not one of us is free until all of us is free. And so we have to recognize this in the way that we approach disasters too. Uplifting marginalized communities and recognizing that it's not us and them, they're right here, right? All of the people in this room right here, right now, come from different perspectives, from different life paths, from different races, creeds, religions, abilities, backgrounds. All of us have these different perspectives, so thinking monolithically, thinking about us all as being like the people who are here in this really sexy 2-hour presentation and are going to be coming out to the really awesome 6-hour workshop tomorrow.
At 10 a.m.
At 10 a.m. We have to remember ourselves as being intersectional and amplify these different things as well in our movement. And that leads us to the last stage, which is collective liberation. This is the most exciting one for me because we're not just trying to go back to square one at the end of a disaster, but we're trying to think circularly about these things, coming back and understanding what is it that we want to create in our world, how are we moving forward. This is an opportunity for revolution. We recognize that in this image here, we see this really amazing spread of all of these different animals that come from different parts of our world, the air, the land, the water, all of them being endangered species, which I think is very pertinent for this image here too. They're building a circle. And they're remembering up in the top left-hand corner here, in the top right-hand corner, these songs. And they have these collections of books. And I think that this is really powerful too, because just like was mentioned earlier with burnout in this culture of activism here in the United States, we have to recognize that when we lose people to burnout, we're losing integral parts, we're losing words to the song of our collective narrative. And if we do that, we lose parts of ourselves and our ability to fight against these struggles and to build things that we want to create in our world. And this chair here is left open because we recognize that there's more room at the table for talking and building in these movements too. Uno mucho si is this image that's exploding out of this kernel that this ant is holding here. It's this collective dream, this work that we're building together. There's one big no, uno, and many S's, mucho si. We're able to live in a world where we can think of the abstract, everything that we hate, this laundry list of all of these different oppressions that we're fighting every single day that are inflicting damage upon us and the people that we love. But it's that collective dreaming of being able to build the world that we want with all of these different dimensions and avenues and all of this different color that gives us strength. And lastly, we see this image here by Emory Douglas. He's the artist, really famous within the Black Panthers. He's still touring and creating art today. In the top left-hand corner here, it says revolution in our lifetime, as in the revolution will not be televised, it will be lived. right? The revolutionary actions are happening right here in this room right now. It's happening outside of it. The revolution isn't something to be anticipated. The revolution is ongoing, right? It's been going on since before we were born. It's been going on for thousands of years against these oppressive structures, and we can tap into that. And we can continue to plant the seeds so that future generations will be a part of that. I like to say that the revolution isn't something we're gonna like knock on a door and go down some stairs and find some like secret door where we say a password and then there's gonna be people with like Kalashnikovs and like that's the revolution. Like I really hope that it doesn't get to a stage in which we will need to arm ourselves to participate in the revolution. I like to think that the rinky-dink revolution, this idea of like the revolution happening in small chipping aways every single day, we're working, we're building our communities, and then one day we'll wake up and we'll say, holy, we did it. We're living. That's the revolution, right? We don't need to martyr ourselves. I was gonna steal your words, but I want
You
to
can
hear you
say
say
that.
it.
That's fine.
It's not a death
I will
march.
allow it.
Thank you. It's not a death march. It's not a funeral procession. Being a part of this, we wave these flags, right, of color, and we fly under them, and we live under them, and we love under them, and that's I think the most important part that we need to recognize, is that we're living for this. We're not dying for this. And so when we think about the world that's destroyed all around us in the wake of these disasters, we can think of the words of Buenaventura Durruti. He was an anti-fascist and an anarchist in Spain during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. This phrase is written on the back of our t-shirts. And it goes something to the effect of, although our enemy, the fascists, the capitalists, these destroyers of the earth, might blast and ruin this world before they leave the stage of history, we are not in the least afraid of ruins, because we hold in our hearts a new world, and that world is growing every minute. And everybody in this room is a part of that world, and that's what we're hoping to share. We're not going to teach you all how to tarp roofs tomorrow, but we are going to hope to collectively dream and envision how we can build each other up in these wakes of disasters.
Thank you.
I like your positive message.
I needed to hear it.
Yeah.